We were very sorry to learn earlier this week of the passing of Dr. Cyril Wecht, the world-renowned pathologist who was the head coroner in Allegheny County when Jamie Stickle died. When we began our investigation into Jamie's mysterious death, Dr. Wecht's name came up again and again, and while he did not personally conduct her autopsy, he was kind enough to review it with us all these years later. His expert assessment and frank interpretation of the investigation has helped us tremendously, and we thank him for his contribution.
This podcast is investigative in nature. The theories and opinions expressed herein belong to the speaking parties and do not necessarily coincide with those of the series producers. Also, we are so grateful that our listeners are interacting with the show in the form of comments and posts on social media. However, we would remind you that this is a true story, and the friends and family of the victim may be reading your posts. Please be respectful of their loss and of their privacy.
I'm Evan Moore, and I'm a supporter of the show. Previously on The Girl with the Same Name.
I remember trying to collect money for a reward, for information. We wanted to know.
I think there had been one full-blown fundraiser, event of some sort, within the first year. Then after that, probably around a year's anniversary. I think by then there was missing money from some reward fund.
We've had the fundraisers, the money that we collected is somehow evaporated. Nobody knows where it's at. If it was supposed to be with Delta, then Delta evaporated, so nobody knows where that money went to.
Hello, listeners. We are back. If you are listening to the show in real time, you probably know we've had a lot going on, and it's been more than a month since we released our last episode. We've also been spending extra time on this episode making sure we dot all our I's and cross all our T's, because today we are following the money. If you are just joining the show, as always, we recommend starting with episode 1. Things will make a lot more sense if you do. A month after Jamie Stickle died, and long before the investigation of her death grew stagnant, her friends and colleagues began a memorial campaign befitting the life she had lived.
She was a very good person, always raising money for breast cancer or different nonprofits.
She was always doing a benefit or collecting money or doing this or doing that or making sure we were all okay.
I'll remember one fundraising event she did where we threw whipped cream pies. It paid money to throw whipped cream pies at different people, and she had Chuck Hans and different myself and different people that sat there for her fundraising thing, but people just had a blast.
She was an activist in the community to bring people together and to raise money for incredible causes like breast cancer, multiple sclerosis, and AIDS.
Jamie was a driving force in fundraising. She could raise money unbelievable, and she would just take something and run with it.
In the spirit of raising money for charitable causes, some of the owners of the local gay bars, including David Morrow, Chuck Hans, Tony Rubino, Joe O'Connell, as well as Wayne Moon, the manager of Images who had taken over Jamie's position there when she left to tend bar at Sidekicks, all banded together to sell pins bearing the United for Jamie slogan that had emerged in the month since her passing.
I began to take an interest in the case, thinking that we could do something at the year anniversary.
That's Marty Levine, who was the news editor at the Pittsburgh City paper and wrote several articles covering Jamie's story over the years since her death.
We got notice that there was going to be public events, more fundraising for the reward. And so that's when we took notice that maybe we could at least give that publicity.
According to an interview Chuck Hans gave to Out magazine at the time, the fund was set up to raise money for a reward for information leading to an arrest for Jamie Stickle's murder. That fund was established with a local charitable giving organization called the Lambda Foundation. Per a 2008 press release, Lambda existed to foster for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people educational, social, cultural, health, and artistic projects and programs in the greater Pittsburgh area through grants and scholarships to organizations and individuals. So it made sense to park the funds there. And then things got quiet. We already know that the police investigation did not yield any significant results, and after 6 months, the case was marked inactive. Over the next year, Hans gave several updates on the United for Jamie Fund to interviewers from Out magazine. As of May 2002, the fund had raised a total of $17,603, and in July of 2002, an ad was run in that same paper offering an $18,000 reward for information regarding Jamie's suspicious death. By March of 2003, he told Out the fund was over $20,000. Then, in 2004, August Pusateri, also known as Buzz Pusateri, the treasurer of the Lambda Foundation, was quoted as saying, "The money is still there, accruing interest. It's there and it's protected." A total of $16,910.40 is being held in an interest accruing account at PNC Bank. This is the first instance where we have heard of the funds raised in the name of Jamie Stickle actually declining. This does not necessarily indicate any wrongdoing or mishandling of funds. However, we can speculate on a number of legitimate possibilities wherein $2,000 to $3,000 could have gone missing. It's possible Chuck Hans's earlier counts or quotes were inaccurate. There may have been expenses associated with the various fundraisers, or perhaps it was used for charitable purposes in Jamie's name. Maybe there was a lead in her case and a small reward was paid. Unfortunately, we don't have those answers because the Lambda Foundation went out of business in the beginning of 2014. Well, not exactly.
In 2012, I believe,
That's Chuck Hans.
the Lambda Foundation and the Delta Foundation merged because the Lambda Foundation had lost its sources of income and it was just dwindling the money away. And so their secretary and me, a founder of the Delta Foundation as well, lived in the same house. And so while we were planting flowers, and I suggested to him that maybe, instead of letting it just dwindle away, that we merge together. And I offered him, without even talking to the board, I offered him a couple of board seats, but I knew that they would. And ultimately that's what happened. We merged. Their money came over to the Delta Foundation, and they received 3 board seats, which was a third of the board.
And I'm sorry, who was the secretary of Lambda at that time?
Oh, his name was August Pusateri.
Mr. Pusateri passed away in 2020 at the age of 81, several years before our investigation began. So, just a little economic aside. In 2004, when Buzz Pusateri gave that quote to Out magazine, the average U.S. savings account interest rate was 1.36%, and over the course of the next 10 years, it went as high as 6% and dipped as low as 0.06%. By our rough calculations, if the $16,910.40 was protected in a simple interest-bearing savings account from 2004 through the end of 2013, that fund should have earned approximately $3,600 in interest, bringing it to a total of $20,482. Chuck Hans's idea of a merger in 2012 became a reality in January 2014 when the Lambda Foundation was absorbed by another Pittsburgh philanthropic organization, the Delta Foundation. According to the Delta Foundation's LinkedIn profile,
originally incorporated on July 17, 1996 as a spin-off of the Lambda Foundation, the Delta Foundation of Pittsburgh is the leading nonprofit advocacy organization for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT community in western Pennsylvania. The Delta Foundation produces Pittsburgh Pride every June, which is the largest LGBT event in Pennsylvania and the 4th largest special event in Pittsburgh, with over 175,000 attendees in 2017.
On January 3, 2014, Gary Van Horn, then president of the Delta Foundation, sent an email to Lambda Foundation board member Chuck Lukehart. It read,
"Chuck, please cut a check for $87,195.57, made payable to the Delta Foundation of Pittsburgh. That will leave $1 in the Lambda Foundation account at PNC Bank. That $87,195.57 will be applied to the following accounts.
The email listed 4 accounts, including
Stickle Fund, $10,207.46.
So in the 10 years that followed the update from Buzz Pusateri, instead of growing by $3,600, the United for Jamie Fund lost $6,700. We spoke to Ann Bowman, the former executive director of the Lambda Foundation.
I don't know if I can give you much information. I mean, when we merged with the Delta Foundation, all the paperwork went with them, and all the accounts went with them.
Right, of course. Yeah, we were just hoping you might have some recollection of a specific fund, the Jamie Stickle Fund or the United for Jamie Fund. It was supposed to be a protected fund, and we were trying to find out if any disbursements were made from it while it was being held at Lambda.
I'd love to be helpful, but I have no idea what happened after the Delta Foundation fiasco.
When Lambda was absorbed by Delta?
They picked up, everybody's grant application, copies of the checks, everything. It went to them. Every record from Lambda's inception. Yeah. We have really good records. I mean, and it all went to Delta.
Do you remember if the Stickle Fund was mixed with other accounts while it was at Lambda, or was it segregated?
That money was segregated. I have no idea. I have no idea what the amount was because we had separate accounts for everything. You know what I mean?
Is it possible that any of the fund was dispersed by Lambda?
We might have given a scholarship out of it, or one scholarship. We usually gave out $5,000 scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
This is so long ago for me. All the records, they came and picked all the records up from every record. So I don't have anything.
Do you know if there's anybody else who was on the Lambda board who might have a recollection of those board meetings, or if there had been that kind of disbursement of funds?
Howard Cherry, but he's very ill.
We decided to call Reverend Howard Cherry, and we're very pleased to find he was doing well and was willing to speak with us. Do you happen to remember if there were any disbursements made from the Jamie Stickle Fund while you were on the board of the Lambda Foundation?
There were no, to my recollection, there were no disbursements from that fund or to that fund. During my tenure in connection with the Lambda Foundation, which is now defunct.
Got it. We're trying to get a hold of the books from Lambda, which we understand were transferred to the Delta Foundation.
Unfortunately, yes. They were transferred to Delta, and from my understanding, I lost track of what was going on, but I know that there was some malfeasance there connected with the Delta Foundation.
Yes, we've heard something of that, and we are looking into it.
I know during my tenure with the Lambda Foundation, there were no disbursements from that fund to my knowledge.
Right. Understood. Okay, well, I think that's everything. If you think of anything else, please feel free to call us back. We're just here plugging away at this.
Okay, you take care. Have a good one.
At this point, it seemed we weren't going to find out more about the Lambda Foundation's holding of the United for Jamie Fund without somehow retrieving their books and records, the whereabouts of which no one seems to know. But half an hour later, Reverend Cherry, we weren't expecting to hear back from you so soon.
I was just digging up some of the files on my computer, and I noticed in January 2011, minutes of the Lambda Foundation Board of Directors. Let's see. There is this line: the time has expired on the restrictions for the Jamie Stickle Fund. Ann Bowman has proposed to reinvest the money in the general fund pursuant that the original's donor's intent for a temporary time restriction has expired. This renders the funds unrestricted, and Bowman so moved to do so. Buzz Pusateri seconded, and the vote was affirmative, yes. And then there's an additional paragraph on these January 2011 minutes that gives me confusion here. It says, in honor of Jamie Stickle's memory and the fiduciary responsibility of administering these funds, and while persons who were on the board at the time these funds were given to the Lambda Foundation are still on the present board, the Lambda Foundation is starting a Jamie Stickle Fund to fund grants with issues dealing with women and youth concerns. Buzz Pusateri so moved, Patrick Journay seconded. There were yes affirmative. But I dug that out. I don't know whether that's of any help to you or not.
It absolutely is. Yeah, that's actually really great news, because it sounds like, even though we don't know whether the funds were granted, we do know that permission was given. So it would have been done appropriately.
Right. But beyond that, I don't remember any disbursements from that.
At this point, we still have not been able to get a copy of the Lambda Foundation's books, and no one specifically recalls any disbursements made from the Jamie Stickle Fund. But based on the minutes of the January 2011 Lambda board meeting, it does appear that the funds had been protected up until that point, and then were moved from their interest-bearing account at PNC Bank into Lambda's general fund. When a new fund was created in Jamie's name, we don't know whether it was the full amount that was transferred from the original fund into the general fund, and we don't know if any of it was then dispersed. What we do know is that 3 years later, when the entirety of the Lambda Foundation's funds were transferred to the Delta Foundation, only $10,207.46 was designated as part of the Jamie Stickle Fund. And while we don't yet know how those funds were used, we have no reason to believe they were misused or misappropriated. In fact, everyone we have spoken to regarding the Lambda Foundation and its board have had nothing but glowing things to say. And based on the minutes from that January 2011 board meeting, it sounds like the appropriate steps were being taken to properly disperse those funds. If you or anyone you know was the recipient of a grant or scholarship from the Jamie Stickle Fund distributed by the Lambda Foundation, we want to hear from you. You can call our tip line or send us an email to thegirlwiththeSameName@gmail.com. So what's the deal with this, quote, fiasco at the Delta Foundation that Ann Bowman referred to? We sat down for a conversation with two former board members from Delta.
First and foremost, Jeff and I did serve on the Delta Foundation board for a few years.
That's Jim Shepard speaking.
I believe that I joined the Delta Foundation board in 2012, if I remember correctly. And then Jeff only joined the board himself in
the last year.
And that is Jeff Friedman.
The end of 19 to 19, I think 2019.
By the way, Jim and Jeff are now partners, co-owning and operating Qberg, an online and print news source for LGBTQ news and community resources in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania. Full disclosure, we have been working with Jim Shepard and his team at Qberg on our investigation of Jamie Stickle's death, and he has been an invaluable contributor to this podcast.
I did it as a favor to get here. I didn't want to join the board, and I did it the 1 year. I filled the treasurer's term for 1 year, and in December I was going to be off. And then everything hit the fan.
What hit the fan?
So the longtime president of the Delta Foundation was a gentleman by the name of Gary Van Horn. So on December 18th of 2019, Gary Van Horn gets arrested. he was arrested for impersonating a police officer and forging the signature of the sheriff of Allegheny County. That's the county where Pittsburgh is. It was very public. It was in the news. The president of the Delta Foundation, as the primary planner of Pittsburgh Pride at the time, was a very prominent figure. So it was very newsworthy. I guess it was October 2019 as well. The vice president stepped down. She resigned from the board. So that kind of left Jeff and myself as the officers of the board. And the board decided to assign me as interim president in the emergency capacity and keep Jeff in the treasurer's role. I didn't intend originally to investigate any financial stuff with the Delta Foundation and that interim role. But literally days before Christmas, I can remember Jeff calling me because Gary had run the foundation a very iron-fisted way, and folks really didn't have full access to everything. Even Jeff, in his capacity as treasurer, really didn't have full access to everything. So whenever Gary kind of stepped aside and I took over as interim president, we got Jeff access to everything. And days before Christmas of 2019, Jeff called me and he found something that was at least suspicious. It was evidence of some mismanagement of money.
Wow. Okay, so at this point, the Lambda Foundation had already been absorbed by Delta?
From my understanding, in about November of 2013, the Lambda Foundation approached Gary and the Delta Foundation about merging into the Delta Foundation with the promise that the funds would continue. There was a scholarship fund. There were a couple different funds, and that also included the Jamie Stickle Fund as well.
We've said it before, Pittsburgh is a small town, and gay Pittsburgh is even smaller. We asked Jim to guide us through some of the names and help untangle the web just a little bit.
You mentioned just briefly a little bit ago, Images Bar. Chuck Hans was the owner and manager of that for a while and was Jamie's boss. But Chuck Hans then sold that bar to Gary Van Horn. Chuck Hans was at one time on the Lambda Foundation board, but then, like we mentioned, Jeff took over as treasurer from Chuck Hans at the Delta Foundation board. And we will get to it at some point where Chuck Hans takes over the treasurer's position from Jeff later in 2020. So there is a bit of a tangled web of individuals under different organizations and names.
Are you confused yet? So are we.
It's like the Nutty Professor movie.
Yeah, where Eddie Murphy is playing all the characters. Yeah.
Even founding the Lambda Foundation, Chuck Hans, there used to be what was called the Tavern Guild here, which, because he was a bar owner and owned several bars here in Pittsburgh, they did a lot of fundraising. They did a lot of community activities here and raised a lot of money, and they were giving that out to charity, and they actually formed the Lambda Foundation with that seed money, so to speak.
That's a really small circle. Was it the same going into Delta?
So at one point, there was a transfer of funds from the Lambda Foundation to the Delta Foundation.
Okay.
Yes. And with it came provisions with the Delta Foundation books, or I want to say provisions. I want to say there was the funds that were put in there, the allocations and stuff, and in the bookkeeping and stuff that was always done and given out to the board members, you would see that the Lambda Foundation funds, and with the Lambda Foundation came 3 board seats they got.
So whenever the Lambda Foundation merged into the Delta Foundation, 3 of the remaining Lambda Foundation board members became Delta Foundation board members, and those were gentlemen by the name of Chuck Lukehart, Patrick Journay, and August Buzz Pusateri, who has since passed away. So as I mentioned, Jeff found stuff like 2 days before Christmas of 2019. That's whenever I, as the interim president of the Delta Foundation, engaged a law firm to begin an internal investigation of all the Delta Foundation finances. And that's kind of whenever we started being able to really dig into the books, We had a forensic accountant look over everything and start digging into like what was really happening here with all the Delta Foundation funds. By January, remember this is only starting in December of 19. By January of 20, I guess it was the 13th here. I had seen enough, and I asked for the resignation, the formal, complete resignation of Gary Van Horn from the board. He had only technically taken a leave of absence, but I asked for his resignation, and he provided that. So the investigation revealed a lot of problems with the Delta Foundation books. Jeff mentioned that we did find, and when we finally accessed the TD Ameritrade account, there was only a penny in there. So the funds that were really saying that they were somewhere on the QuickBooks really weren't anywhere. We found evidence that there was a private business being run out of the Delta Foundation to rent jet skis and boats and stuff to people in Pittsburgh. We found evidence that the employee of the Delta Foundation was also involved under Gary Van Horn with this private business. You saw that a cabbage loan payment was one of the things you flagged. That was not a loan that any board member approved. That was a private loan that Gary Van Horn leveraged the foundation to purchase those jet skis and boats to rent out as a private venture. And other board members would help deliver these jet skis and things like that. This all came to light while we were digging.
Did the Delta Foundation benefit from this business?
Right. So that's confusing. We weren't the queer Buccaneers. Gary Van Horn apparently set up a separate business called Thrill Water Sports LLC, but had the jet skis. It was 12 jet skis, 2 boats, and a trailer that he had a loan from the Delta Foundation to purchase those items, but they were only used for him to run his private business to rent out those jet skis for him to make personal profit off of. Those funds did not come back to the Delta Foundation.
Got it.
It eventually gets, the pandemic hits. Pride 2020 under the Delta Foundation has to be originally postponed, then canceled. The investigation wraps up, and we're getting ready to make the presentation of all the findings to the full board. And then randomly out of nowhere, I guess the relationship of the three of us soured, and Marty actually asked for Jeff's resignation from the board.
The Marty Jim is referring to is Marty Healy, a board member of the Delta Foundation and the CEO of the Persad Center, which is another LGBTQ-oriented human services organization serving the Pittsburgh and greater Pennsylvania area.
The whistleblower who they're about to give a report on what opens the gate for all this stuff, right? And he's asking for me to resign.
So did you get to present your findings?
So we had that meeting. It was in early July where we presented all that evidence and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. The board, if my memory serves correctly, Jeff, did decide that the law firm should present the findings and the report to the district attorney, if I remember correctly.
Proceed with that, because at the time they were getting charges for Gary being arrested for a separate incident.
Correct.
The impersonation.
So rather than do one case, the DA wanted to hear the evidence for both to see what was going to be his sentencing.
And then what happened?
There was 5 board members, including Marty and some other folks on the board, requested an emergency board meeting where they actually decided to suddenly out of nowhere hold the board elections for president, vice president, and treasurer secretary, which ultimately resulted in, I didn't face election. I knew I could count the room. I knew they didn't like what I found. So they actually ended up electing Marty Healy, the president of the Delta Foundation, at that meeting. And they elected Chuck Hauntz back to being treasurer and some other folks into the other officer positions. And then by 2 weeks after that, in August of 2020, the rest of the Delta Foundation board votes to dissolve the foundation.
Wow.
Right. So since all of that, in 2020, supposedly the findings of that internal investigation were turned over to the district attorney's office. And supposedly the district attorney's office said there was no misgivings here, and nothing ever came of it. Marty Healy is no longer the volunteer president of the Persad Center. He is now the paid CEO of the Persad Center. The Delta Foundation is still listed on PA Department of State records as still being an active nonprofit organization, though no one has ever seen where any money went to, and no one got refunds from Pittsburgh Pride 2020 being canceled. No one knows, supposedly, where the Jamie funds are, the Lambda funds are. They're all gone. We know that. And, Jeff and I went on to form Kuberg. So that's where we are.
But in our conversation with Chuck Huntz, we got some different information. We asked him to explain what happened to the United for Jamie Fund when it was transferred from Lambda to Delta.
So when that happened, their general fund came over, as well as 3 restricted funds, one of them being the Jamie Stickle Fund. Okay. But it had already been changed to, instead of reward fund, to support women's issues.
That lines up with what Reverend Cherry found in the January 2011 Lambda Board meeting minutes.
And then it came over to us, and still a restricted fund, and it's still there. We're in the process of unwinding the Delta Foundation. It should be completely closed and finished next year. We weren't able to get it done this year. But everything we do with that has to be overseen by the Attorney General's office.
Because it's a 501c3?
Yeah. And so we're close. We still have a few debts to pay. And we should probably, we'll definitely have it closed next year. And then we'll have to decide where that money goes. So we'll send it to another 501c3.
Okay, so it hasn't actually gone to like women's issues organizations?
Delta Foundation never dispersed it to anybody, and I don't think that Lambda did either. When the check came over to us, it was $10,276, 79, 49, something.
About 10 grand.
10,200. And it's still there in a restricted fund.
We also reached out to Marty Healy for a comment.
Same money is, I believe, has always been around. Now, I mean, the intent for this money is for women's or lesbians' health. I mean, that's the goal. And quite frankly, as the organization dissolves, that's where it'll land.
But of course, we couldn't just take anyone's word for it. Not when we had our hands on the Delta Foundation's 2022 QuickBooks file, which Jason brought to Jennifer Magnus, senior co-managing partner at the forensic accounting firm of White, Zuckerman, Orzovsky, Luna, Wolf, and Hunt. He showed her a number of payments made to Gary Van Horn from Delta's PNC account, where the Jamie Stickle Fund was held.
What you have to look at, though, Jason, is see how on the bottom there it says account GVH paid expenses?
Yes.
Down. That's a category in the QuickBooks.
Right.
And when you go into that, it's a liability account. So basically the charity owed him money for things that he had been paying for. And it appears these checks were to reimburse him for that, to pay down that debt. Well, the only activity appears to be in 2014 when it received the $10,000, and then there's only a $1,000 offset, which was for University of Pittsburgh. And so, like, the real question is, what did this foundation say that the monies they received were going to be used for, right? Because it's never that the whole amount is going to go towards an actual use of the charity. Part of it has to go to salaries and, administrative costs. So how did they allocate it? Did they say it was going to be 70% for the charity and 30% for administrative? What did they say, and did they actually effectuate that? And then what's happened to the remaining amounts? Because when I look at the QuickBooks you gave me, again, I pulled up just, a P&L for 14. It looked like there was only $1,000 that was allocated against this specific, the Jamie Stickle Fund. And then what happened? So there's 9,000 left. So then what happened to it? Right? Because it's just sitting there.
So the QuickBooks file confirms what Chuck Hans indicated, that the Jamie Stickle Fund went basically untouched between 2014, when it was transferred to the Delta Foundation, and today. We do have one disclosure of our own to make. In February of 2024, we got a call from Chuck Hans.
Anyway, I spoke with Marty, and we want to research the possibility of maybe making a grant to you guys from the Jamie Stickle Fund.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I'm going to work on that, and I'll get back to you. And if we do, then we'll get back to you to see about how to get that to you.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll need to talk to Jamie about that too, just because I want to make sure that we're not, that there isn't a conflict of interest there in some respect.
Well, you do that and let me know, because I'd like to make a decision on that this week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If I can.
Okay.
I mean, it could wait past that. It's not urgent. But there's discussion there that this would be an appropriate use of her money.
Knowing that we would eventually be investigating and reporting on the Jamie Stickle Fund, we decided that accepting a grant from that fund would constitute a conflict of interests. And besides, that money is meant to go towards a reward for helping find Jamie's killer, or toward charitable causes like those Jamie supported when she was alive. So where does this leave us? We are happy to know that the money raised in Jamie's name is still there and will hopefully soon be put to good use. We are, of course, disappointed to know that, like so many aspects of her story following her death, the United for Jamie Fund languished. Perhaps the impending distribution of the money will offer some solace to her family. Hopefully the Delta Foundation or the next recipients of the fund will contact Jamie's family and consult them about how best to utilize the money raised in her memory. We are not finished with this story. We are still working on getting the Lambda Foundation's financial records and figuring out in what ways the fund was utilized. But for now, it is time for us to return to our investigation of the true crime, the murder of Jamie Stickle. Next time, on The Girl with the Same Name. If you enjoy The Girl with the Same Name, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. It would really help us out. You can follow the show on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at The Girl with the Same Name. And you can sign up for our mailing list on our website, thegirlwiththesamename.com. This is an ongoing investigation. If you have any information about Jamie Stickle's life or death, we want to hear from you. Please call our tip line at 412-822-6123 or send us an email to thegirlwiththeSameName@gmail.com. Or you can call the Pittsburgh Police tip line at 412-323-7800. If you have photos, video, or audio recordings of Jamie, you can send them to us or share them on social media and tag the show at The Girl with the Same Name. The Girl with the Same Name is a production of Make That Paper Productions. I am your host, Jamie Stickle. This episode was researched, written, and produced by myself and Jason Bieber, and our assistant producer is Madison Westenheiser. The show was edited and sound designed by Jason Bieber. Chloe Naffey and Morgan Monfredo were our interns. The original theme song was composed and recorded by Brian Hendricks. Additional music and sound effects are from freesounds.com or were generated using Songburst AI. We would like to thank the following people who generously contributed their time and expertise. Our legal counsel is Amanda Moghadam. We received private investigation assistance from Lori Rokenbeck. Our law enforcement advisor is Sergeant Brandon Roy. And Superfan Promotions did our publicity. We'd like to send an enormous thank you to all our Kickstarter supporters. Without your contributions and belief in our work, we would not have been able to tell Jamie's story. Thank you. And special thanks go out to Parvesh China, Brian Assman, George Leon, Daniel Alexander, Jim Shepard, Grant Wood, Stephen Skoblick, and April Cass.